All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the April 11th meeting of the Gateway API Gamma Initiative. Um, as always, Kubernetes Code of Conduct rules are in effect. We have an open agenda. It's linked in the meeting invite. Please feel free to add your name to the list of attendees. And if you have any topics you want to discuss, please add them to the meeting notes. We'll start off with a recap of kind of what we went over last week because we're doing alternating time slots. So one is more EU friendly, one is more US West Coast and Asia Pacific friendly. So with that, I will pause for a moment. It looks like we have a few new faces here. If anyone wants to take a moment to introduce themselves.
I can say hi since I spoke up earlier. I've been sitting on quite a few of these, at least the ones that I can that are earlier. Mike Stefaniak, I'm a senior product manager over at NGINX, working on our service mesh product.
Welcome.
Welcome. Good to have you.
You should add your name to the meeting notes.
Yeah, I am pulling it up right now.
And while we're at it, I shall paste the link to the meeting notes just so that it's there.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, I guess with that, if there's anybody else, we can start with a recap. So yeah, last week was a relatively short meeting, mostly dealing with logistical type things. So Shane is going to be doing the SIG network intro at KubeCon EU next week. Yes.
Yeah, is it that horrifying?
Yeah, and just wanted to mention that Gamma will get a shout out. Shane, if you want to say anything else about that again at this point.
No, I mean, not much to say. There will be a shout out to Gamma. Let people know that let people in general kind of know. In the past, Gamma's been kind of like you had to be connected to Gateway API to know that we're kind of doing this. We're getting far enough along now that it's worth there's a page there that kind of says, hey, this is something that's happening for Service Mesh. If you're interested, come join us.
Awesome. Excited to see that happen and hopefully get some more participation from maybe some end users.
Yep,
cool.
that is the goal is end users, and I will make that emphasis when I do the presentation.
Awesome, sounds good. All right, Flynn started some work on doc on Gamma user stories. Definitely thanks to folks who've already commented. This is intended to be a living document that we're going to try to basically use to like articulate what are the things you should be able to do with Gamma as separated from kind of how you actually do it. So this is hopefully going to inform some of like how we approach API design and some of the decisions that we're making to make sure that we're able to at least do the things that we want to do. Yeah.
Some folks those of you who have already commented will have probably noticed that not a lot of replying to comments has happened. That's mostly because after the last Gamma meeting, I kind of got eaten alive by the Linkerd 2.13 release for a bit, but I will be coming back to that.
Awesome. And I am going to have some content to add to that too.
Excellent.
All right. The April 18th meeting, so next week's meeting, it's typically a different time slot, but it's also canceled for KubeCon EU because many of us will be going for that. The week after we'll have meeting at the regular scheduled time, so this time slot, and hopefully we will start off with a recap of KubeCon EU and anything interesting and discussions that happened there. Rob has been making the rounds talking about the V070 feature freeze. I think that it is in API review now, and there's some open comments, and like I think PR is welcome to address some like small things. Is that still the case, Rob?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. If you see there are some comments that are really, kind of good first issue type comments that we haven't translated to issues. I think the goal would be to translate them to issues, but if before that happens, you've got some time to run through, you can help speed up the 0.7 release simply by running through those comments and seeing if you can tackle some. And please, if you are working on them, just comment on the comment itself. It says, "I'll take this." But otherwise, we're just trying to get those comments resolved as soon as possible and get V0.7 out quickly, hopefully.
All right. That'd be great. And we'll try to follow up and make sure the link to that gets added in the notes here in case anyone is interested. And then Rob again, the MCS plus Gateway API GEP, I believe has merged now, which is pretty exciting.
Yep. Thank you so much. I know a lot of people left some good feedback on there, incorporated all your suggestions, and yeah, excited to get that in.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think the last thing we went over last time was just trying to start discussion of meetup plans, contributor summit sessions, etc. for KubeCon next week. I think Robert Shane, if you wanted to pitch the Gateway API meetup thing that's happening, I think that's what we're gonna try to glom onto.
Yep. So we have. Wait. Yeah. Okay. So we have a workshop, a 1-hour workshop. I actually don't know off the top of my head. They just accepted it when exactly it is, where it will be kind of just, we'll have a format in mind, but it's kind of just going to be open discussion, kind of like what we did last time potentially. Although if people want to go ahead and start suggesting like specific agenda items, we can kind of try to organize that, do that soon, since that's a week away.
And is there a time for the schedule for that yet?
There is a time slot. I have to go find it.
Okay.
It looks like it's
I don't-
11:30 in the morning. I'll drop a link to the schedule.
Yes, please. I didn't see when. So I also have an update. Shane and I have an update talk that I submitted. That is what we're doing in Gateway API that other parts of Kubernetes might care about. So that probably won't be directly relevant to Gamma, but it, I anticipate that we will get a number of questions. I'm planning on covering stuff like policy attachment, reference grant, conformance testing, and profiles and stuff like that.
And that's going to be a contributor summit talk.
Yeah, that's contributor
Awesome.
talk. Yeah.
Yeah, I got the times wrong. Nick's talk, Nick with Shane are talking at 11:30. The overall meetup is 2:40 in the afternoon.
Okay, cool.
Is it CST? I'll leave CST and someone can correct me. All right. 11 a.m. is the SIG network overview, or is that Gamma specific? Or sorry, Gateway specific?
That is what's happening. Oh, sorry, which one? 11:30 a.m. Is the Gateway API overview, I guess.
Okay.
Whatever. I think Shane and Nick are presenting that. So.
All right. Well, yeah. So there's definitely some stuff going. If you want to find some friendly faces or folks that you have not met yet who may be interested in similar topics, definitely would encourage folks to check out some of this stuff. All right. So that's kind of recap of mostly what we covered last week. And I can hand it off to Mike Beaumont if you want to briefly talk about Kuma starting on Gamma, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know that there's another implementation of the Gamma coming. We're going to add Gamma support to the existing Gateway API support. Nothing much there at the moment, but yeah, so that's like a short-term goal of ours to have our conformance tests also running the mesh tests. Yeah, so that might be interesting.
Very cool.
Awesome. All right. Nick, some clarifications from the discussion on the link that I'm going to open.
Yes.
Keith,
On this
yeah,
one,
got it.
yep, John and I got into a discussion that I thought was probably useful for me to clarify a little bit. I had a chat with John earlier today. Yes, John was talking about the differences between cluster IP gateways and binding to a service that has a cluster IP. And I thought it was probably a good idea to just for me to clarify at least what I think, because we worked pretty hard originally on the definition of like what is a gateway, and I think that definition we don't do a good job of pushing the part that's and it's really relevant for this. So a gateway we kind of defined originally as a thing that it translates from a place that doesn't have context of inside the cluster networking to a place that does. Most of the time that's outside, i.e. the internet, and inside. But in the case of a cluster IP, that's a bit murky because it's all inside, right? But the intent here is that by declaring a gateway with a cluster IP, it's kind of saying, if you think of like, okay, this is a cluster. And when you're doing a service binding, you are going from one service directly to another, like literally east-west. When you are doing a cluster IP gateway, you are sort of going north to sort of the very edge of the cluster and then back south again to the destination pod. And so there's kind of an implied loss of context or possibly a change in security domain or other things like that because you're going logically outside the cluster. Actually, the routing that you'll never go outside the cluster, blah, blah, blah. But the logically, the idea here is that there's like an implied translation or loss of context or possibly a change of security context by going outside to the outside of a cluster IP address. And so I wanted to just clarify that's in my mind, that's the difference between a gateway that has a cluster IP and a service that has a cluster IP that uses HTTP route binding or whatever else we end up doing for Gamma. Is that what we're talking about for Gamma does not have that sort of translation or implied context change. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I feel that might be somewhat controversial for the like cluster IP gateway, as it has been discussed at times as a potential like new front end for the service, where I can see a desire for there to be a variation of it to somehow that does not lose that context, like the way that service we're assuming that it is aware and so yeah, like it makes sense to me. I think there are definitely roles in Gamma for cluster IP gateways that shield context. So like for Consul's use case, it's definitely going to make sense like at the edge of a cluster for how we're doing multi-cluster networking, where we're like at the edge of an administrative boundary where you may have a team that has exported a service to you, but you really should not have any context as to like how that service is being managed behind the gateway. Like there is
Mike,
a
doesn't
role
that imply that the gateway
both ways.
doesn't that imply that gateway where you have no context behind it would be defined as arguably losing that context?
Yes. Yeah. So like there's, I think that there is definitely a place in Gamma for cluster IP gateways that shield context or do not expect the like traffic ingress in it to have context for what's behind it. That is definitely a thing that will exist.
I confess that I'm a little
other needs too.
I'm a little uncertain as to why you would want to use a gateway resource if you don't intend to mean that it's a different domain behind it. Right.
Yeah, and I
Why
guess
would it
yeah.
make sense to have a cluster IP assigned to a gateway inside your cluster that doesn't transit to someplace else, that where both sides of the gateway are administratively securative, with respect to security, et cetera, they're both sides are the same. Why would you want to use a gateway in that case? And that
that
is
was
a question, even though it's phrased somewhat antagonistically. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So that is the point that I was trying to make, that as it stands today, I certainly have that assumption. And I think that assumption is sort of, marbled through a lot of the gateway documentation, that is what a gateway means. And so I wanted to make sure that I had explained that in this forum, so that we could be clear that, hey, when you're doing that, you're like, if you think of it in very old school terms, with back in the days of like actually having a network with a firewall that did that, you are hairpinning, right? Like you're sending the traffic to the outside of the firewall, and then it's coming back in, right? Like, not actually doing that, obviously, but like logically, that's what you're doing. Like when the traffic comes in that firewall, it's now from outside. That the context is it's not coming from some other VLAN in the same network. It's from outside, and that's the sort of the thing that I'm trying to get to here. And I think that the cluster IP gateway stuff we're talking about, sort of in the main part of Gateway API, is important for that sort of context where, for something like Knative, where you're doing, you want to go east to west, but you actually want to lose the context to some extent, right? Like they want to sort of, that's kind of desirable to some extent. And so, yeah, I think that's why I wanted to call this out, that it felt really important to make sure that everyone who's following Gamma sort of understands that that's the implicit assumption of what a gateway is.
The multi-cluster case is also pretty interesting, where if you use a gateway if you use a thing that serves the function that we commonly call a gateway in English, and I'm intentionally separating that from a gateway resource for the moment, for communications between one cluster and another cluster in the same multi-cluster setup, then there I could see getting into an interesting conversation about how much context should be retained, but still feeling like when you cross the cluster boundary, you can't rely on a lot. So
yeah, and that's crossing the cluster boundary is sort of that's probably a more succinct way of saying it. I avoided using those terms earlier because then you have to spend some time defining on what a cluster boundary is. And so so that's why I generally tend to speak in very general terms. This is RFC style language that has been hardened over the course of many months of backwards and forwards about definitions. And so that's why a lot of the time when I talk about this is very vague. But so, yeah, I just thought it was really important to call out that's sort of the implied difference, and that if we try to use cluster IP gateway in the same way that we're like as a direct one-to-one substitute for binding a HTTP route to a service, I think we will run foul of that sort of assumption.
Robin's thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's covered in the comments. I looked through what Nick and John had in the comment thread as well, and I think they covered it well. But I think so far we've been really focused on the idea that gateway is what it is today, and it may happen to have a cluster IP address. There's also a future idea that gateway behaves very similarly to service front end. Kind of a longer term goal of this project is that gateway takes a lot of the functionality of service front end and becomes that. At that point, this conversation becomes a little bit different, maybe. But in the state we currently are in, I agree with what's said.
I'm actually not thrilled with having a gateway take over the role of a service front end for a lot of the reasons that we have just been discussing. I feel like, totally aside from the idea that you've got 100 gateways in your cluster, right? But part of what a service means
Yeah.
to me is that it is a thing that lives within exactly the same context, exactly the same security domain as all the other services and all of the stuff in your namespace. And that does not feel like what a gateway is to me.
I think
Yeah,
You go,
I
Rob.
agree with your assessment of what they are today. I think there's been some high level desire that a service just becomes a way of representing a group of endpoints, basically, and gateways handle the routing. You know, these are theoretical, and I don't know if it actually makes sense to get there, and I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole until we get there, kind of thing. Like it may never make sense. I don't know. It's just kind of it would be cool if this could work. I definitely get your hesitation though.
You're making me very sad here, Rob, because I'm getting the impression that this is another meeting I need to start attending, and that makes me very sad.
No, this is definitely not that. This is kind of like the high level directive, or like not even directive, but hey, if Gateway API was successful, you know, 4 or 5 years from now or whenever, then it would have replaced the service front end. That's one of many things. I don't know if that's actually going to happen, but part of the idea of Gateway API was to try and relieve the pressure on service. At a minimum, we're going to try and replace service type load balancer. I don't know
See,
if
now
we'll
that
replace.
makes a certain amount of sense to me, because a
Right.
service of type load balancer, by definition, is, hey, cluster, give me a way that the external worlds can get traffic from that totally different context into my cluster. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But replacing
So-
a service in general with a gateway does not make sense to me, because that's a
I
very
think
different thing.
I think the key thing is that if we're going to replace other functionality in service with something that's in Gateway API, it needs to not be called Gateway, because
right.
Gateway carries
That's-
all of those assumptions that I just talked about.
Yeah, big
so-
thumbs up.
That's
on
my
that.
thoughts as well. Yeah. Li Wen?
Yeah, so in our implementation, for the VPC ladder, so gateway is kind of like, it's a gateway is mapped to a service network, which basically a VPC ladder construct, for the cloud info. So imagine, in my view, like gateway, it's like your home. You have your home default router, right? You go onto the internet. You may connect to one provider, you may provide to another provider. So in our case, the gateway, as a part of VPC or Kubernetes cluster, you talk to a gateway, suddenly behind the gateway, you have a group of HTTP route. That's the service. So that's in our case, how we implement the gateway.
Okay, interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
context.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. I mean, I think it still carries the same implication that there's a definite difference between things that are in the lattice and things that are outside the lattice, and there's context that is inside the lattice that is not present outside.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that all of us kind of like to wrap this up before we move on. I think all of us have independently seen how service is overloaded. We even have GEPs talking about how the service resource is too big and does too much, and it's awkward that it has two completely different roles. So it doesn't feel that there's a lot of dissension around we need to break it up somehow. We've seen in Gamma that having a service front-end construct is useful. And it feels like it is mostly a question of terminology. So we're seeing with Gamma too, HTTP root is a useful way of expressing things and attaching routing behavior to something. And maybe it's just a different resource that has a different name, but functionally could serve that front end role. So definitely excited to see what the future may bring. Costin?
Yeah, I thought that we are more or less in agreement that the model is that HTTP route is attaching to something that has some characteristics, meaning a VIP or a host name. and we don't really care. I mean, service is just one of those things, but we are no longer tied to service as a way. It could be a service import, it could be something else, including a gateway. The implementation are free to do whatever. That's my understanding of the recent docs that I've read. Are we still in this agreement, or are we changing it again?
I think that's the case, and that's what the GEP is proposing, which is something we'd already discussed, but I think it just wasn't written down. I think what the controversy came from was me saying, well, Gateway can also meet that role. And if Gateway is meeting that role, that potentially is meaning this group says that that is a core thing and kubeproxy starts understanding it, and et cetera, which is kind of a different story. I don't think there's anything preventing a implementation specific gateway class to use Gateway as a front end or their own type or service import, right? That's kind of what the GEP is saying, that anything that serves as a front end can be the parent reference.
And why wouldn't this become a core if enough vendors are willing to do it? I mean, what's wrong with formalizing? We have gateway type internal, so that's already kind of.
So that's what I was just saying, Costin, that the whole point of the gateway thing is that it implies a translation between different contexts. And when you're doing that stuff for like purely east to west, you don't have that translation. And so it's gonna end up being like confused on a conceptual level, which will end up making things, which can end up making things weird. That is what I am saying after having done this sort of API design for quite a while. Like, I don't recommend doing that. I think we should have a separate thing that is whatever the name of that thing is, it needs to be separate to Gateway, because Gateway has a very clearly defined, not clearly defined because people don't know about it, and I just had to spend ages explaining it. But like, it does have that definition is definitely there in the definition of Gateway.
I would be very curious to see where exactly in the gateway specification is required that it translate. I mean, it's an enforcement point, it applies policies. It may as well translate, because even if it's east-west, it does all kind of transformations. I don't think both of the arguments you make that it requires to do some transformation and it doesn't do transformation are kind of not necessarily agreed.
It's not specifically written into the spec in some field, but it is designed with that in mind. And so like, there will be parts of this design of the spec that have that in mind. And if we try and use it in a different way, then it's likely that there'll be impedance mismatches between the way that fields have been designed and used and us trying to do that, right? So it's not specifically written into the spec, otherwise we wouldn't be having this discussion. But it is absolutely designed with that in mind originally. And so I can't say what decisions we have made, that may have been influenced by that will mean that they don't work properly. And there are certainly implementations that are making that assumption already, that if we decided to just use Gateway as a service replacement would not work in the way that people expect.
I'm gonna end this conversation here. Unless Keith, if you have one thing to add, but I'm going to try to move on to the next topic.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to go back to Don's point. That the point of this GEP is really just to open the door for more things to be a parent ref and to describe what the properties are that it needs. If we want to start talking about making things core or not, that's a separate conversation. The purpose here is to not be so limiting on saying the only thing that HTTP route can combine to is service. And I think that sounds like, I've been letting the conversation run for a bit, sounded that's the non-controversial part, which is always what we can start with the non-controversial and then get on to answering more questions later. So that's all I have to say.
No, that sounds great. Yeah. And maybe we just take that to narrow the scope of the GEP to what is agreed upon that seems the non-controversial part. We wrap that up and get that merged, and then open a new discussion eventually on the cluster IP stuff as kind of a separate scope. So yeah, I think it's definitely interesting, and there's definitely a lot of potential there, but also a can of worms. So thanks everyone for your thoughts. And yeah, I'll move on to Rob, meeting times for KubeCon. Did we sort of already touch on this?
Yes, I think we already can. So this is copied verbatim from the meeting yesterday. The reason I wanted to bring, so I think we already know canceled for KubeCon. The other one is we're looking at an EU-friendly meeting time for the main meeting. We've been experimenting with EU-friendly times. Yeah, thank you. So we are considering a couple times. One would be April 26th. The other would be May 2nd. If no one has a strong preference, we'll just flip a coin and choose one. I think, Mike, you commented that I think it was the April 26th one might conflict with the SIG multi-cluster meeting. So maybe that
May
means that we
2nd one,
choose.
actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
May 2nd. Okay.
That
Isn't-
one, if it goes longer than 30 minutes, it'll run into a SIG multi-cluster
Okay.
for any folks who are attending both.
Oh, come on. The Gateway API meeting, I'm sure, would never go longer than 30 minutes.
I'm trying to remember the last time we ended a meeting early. It's been a long time, at least for the main slot. It's been a while.
If we didn't do triage yesterday, that probably may have been
That's
pretty early end.
That's true. Yeah, we got through a lot of triage, and yeah, agreed. So
I
anyway,
make no
that
representations about the fact that I wasn't there, and so it went shorter.
also true. It's great to have you at the morning for me meeting, Nick. But anyways, I think we'll just pick one at random. It seems like we may try and avoid the potential overlap with multi-cluster. So maybe April 26th is leading right now, but you know, if you have opinions, let us know. And then I guess I'll just jump right into my other one, which is just KubeCon. We covered the Contrib Summit, which is Tuesday. There's also a Gateway API update on Wednesday morning. And we're planning some kind of informal lunch sometime afterwards. Just means meet up and eat together somewhere. Nothing fancy, but similar to what SIG Network often does as a larger group. So we can organize on, yeah, SIG Network API, Gateway API, Slack, yeah. Oh, I would be very game for a group bike ride. Okay.
I don't
Yeah,
have any skin in the game because I won't be there. But you know,
No,
saying, if I was in Amsterdam, that's what I would do.
So, you know, I broke my collarbone biking couple months ago now, and I should just finally be cleared to do all the normal things by the time I get to Amsterdam. So yes,
Okay.
biking is very much a key thing for me. But
All right.
Yeah, I might be with Nick here since I twisted a knee skiing a few months ago, and I'm a little but my collarbone is all healed from when I broke that skiing. So Rob, I'm crossing my fingers for you.
thanks.
So yeah, maybe if some folks are interested in biking together, we can try to organize that on Slack as well.
Yeah.
Certainly not a mandatory event. So yeah. Flynn, you have last topic on Linkerd and Gamma?
I was just going to point out, if you have not already seen the announcements, Linkerd 2.13 just shipped. It has our first support in a stable release for Gamma HTTP routes and such. Still very early days for Linkerd, but I just figured I'd make that one a little bit more public.
That's awesome. That's exciting. This is always great having like more milestones of, I mean, just in this meeting we've heard Linkerd and then also like Kuma starting work on it. So yeah, it's great to see kind of adoption picking up pace.
I should probably point out that I do not want to imply that Linkerd 2.13 passes the nascent conformance tests. I am gonna try to build one to run those against. I was gonna try to do that late last week and it didn't happen. So fingers crossed. We'll see how it goes.
Now that we have two implementations, what's the plan to move to beta? I mean, that was
Shouldn't we have two vaguely conformant implementations first?
I think he was joking.
Okay, just making sure.
No, not completely. I mean, it's we need to start discussing because what is missing, so we clear the hurdles.
End user feedback, I think, is the main thing
Yeah.
in my mind. As if we can get some feedback from end
Oh,
users
soak
that,
time.
yeah, so yeah, so that would be great as well.
Details, really.
Yeah, I mean, for clarification, I think most gamma gaps are still in the provisional state, not experimental. I think the bar for experimental is much lower, and we likely are near or at that point. So for reference, and I can link this, it needs to be implemented by several implementation, or actually, no, that's alpha to beta, but to experimental, it's a fairly low bar. We do want conformance tests to be present. We do want implementations to be committed to supporting it. But I think we're very, very close to, it was something that just barely missed the 0.7 release. I would be very sad if it missed the next minor release of Gateway API. So that would be either 0.8 or 1.0, depending on if we need an 0.8.
When would you expect, sorry, not to try to nail you down here,
Yeah.
but what's your gut feeling on timeline for the next minor of Gateway API?
Yeah, so 0.7, what our predicted timeline is I think May 2nd or 3rd right now. Again, we don't have full control over when that happens. We're waiting on some volunteer reviewers, basically. But second to that would be our next release. We are very committed and working as hard as we can to get 1.0 out by Chicago. So that means really October. So we will definitely have at least one release by October. If we need an 0.8, that means that happens between now and October. So that's a pretty accelerated release schedule, but 0.8, if it exists, will be a pretty incremental small release that may just include graduating some existing things like Gamma.
So realistically, that would imply getting stuff for Gamma probably nailed down in the next 4 to 6 weeks is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
And for what it's worth, I think we're extremely close. Like a lot of the things that were on our original milestone, conformance test, gateway to mesh binding, parent ref thing, like a lot of this has been, we've been doing a pretty good job of iterating through. It's just, I think, buttoning up, writing some, like I said, we got conformance tests. So yeah, I think we're really close to just getting some of these interactive nailed down. And scoping is going to be pretty important in helping us do that. Go ahead, Costin.
Yeah, if I can make a second bad joke, should we talk about interop at some point before we go to beta? So we have Linkerd, Istio. Can we talk with each other? Can we have gateways talking with each other? I know.
Oh, dude, Istio and Linkerd never talk to each other. Don't y'all know that by now?
Well, we managed to talk in the working group. Who knows? Maybe we'll figure out the workloads too.
In all seriousness, that is actually something I would like to talk to, I don't know, you, John, whoever is around in Amsterdam. That seems like a fruitful thing to discuss.
Okay, we'll get a lot of drinks and hope find some solution.
Yeah, I think alcohol might be key for that conversation.
I would likewise love to participate in a conversation about interop as a long-term goal. And yeah, I think that's kind of to surface the back on an earlier point. Having that like gateway boundary there for context shielded behind that is going to be an important way for gateways to function in a mesh context between meshes.
Yeah.
Because we don't expect Linkerd to understand all of Istio's config or vice versa.
I think we can make some, sacrifices on both sides and find some common ground, and we'll all have extensions, but if we can agree at least on some common certificates or whatever, I think it will not be, we're not so far away from each other, I think.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting conversation for sure.
Awesome. Definitely looking forward to it. Yeah, let's try to coordinate something like that for folks who have to be at KubeCon and hopefully we can have a recap of any discussion like that when we meet again in 2 weeks. All right. Is there anything else that we want to discuss today before we break? We've got 15 minutes left. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. I will hopefully see a handful of y'all next week in Amsterdam. And for everyone else, take care, have a good 2 weeks, and we will see you back at this time then. Thanks, y'all. Take care. Have a good day.
Cheers, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks
See ya.
much.
Bye.